Mornings in Oak Ridge Lane always started the same way. Sprinklers whispered across trimmed lawns like gossipers trading secrets. Robins hopped between mailboxes, and somewhere down the block, someone's garage radio hummed an old country tune. Rick liked it that way. After 22 years in the Air Force, routine was his comfort food. Every morning, same mug, same seat on the porch, same gentle nod to the mailman who never changed his route. He'd sip his coffee, smell the faint sweetness of cut grass, and watch the neighborhood slowly wake up. The kind of quiet that didn't need explaining. It just existed. Until, of course, the HOA decided to remind everyone it existed too. He'd moved to Cedar Pines 3 years back, trading the roar of engines for the chirp of crickets. His small tan house sat on the corner, the kind of lot realtors call premium visibility, which really meant everyone sees everything you do. Rick didn't mind. He liked a tidy yard. The flag on his porch hung straight. His tools were lined up by height in the garage, and he even fixed his neighbor's loose mailbox once without being asked. He just liked things done right, which is probably what doomed him. Karen lived across the street, in the blue Colonial with the solar walkway lights and the live, laugh, love sign that had faded down to low. She was the self-appointed HOA vice president, though some said self-appointed was redundant in her case. You always knew where she was by the trail of perfume and opinions she left behind. The kind of woman who'd remind you about recycling day even if she saw you rolling the bin out. Twice. Still, Rick got along with her fine in the polite, suburban way people do when they share a street but not much else. He'd wave. She'd wave back sometimes. She even complimented his roses once, which he appreciated until she followed it up with, "They're lovely, though technically, front yard gardens need board approval." Rick smiled, nodded and said, "Guess I'll submit my rose permit soon." She didn't laugh. He did. Started small, like these things always do. One Saturday afternoon, Rick noticed a silver sedan nosed halfway across his driveway. It wasn't blocking him entirely, but close enough that he had to angle around it to park. No big deal, he thought. Maybe a delivery mix-up. He glanced across the street. Sure enough, Karen's driveway was full. 6 cars total, people chatting in sundresses and polo shirts, carrying casserole dishes. Another one of her dinner parties. He sighed, walked over, and said to a man in a golf shirt, "Hey there, neighbor. Mind pulling forward a bit? That's actually my drive." The man blinked at him. "Oh, Karen said we could park here. She said it's fine." Rick tilted his head. "Karen said that about my driveway?" "Yeah." The man shrugged. "She said you're the handyman guy. Thought you wouldn't mind." Rick wasn't angry yet, just confused. "I don't usually, but this is still private property. Could you move up, please?" The guy rolled his eyes but complied. A small thing. Forgettable if it had ended there. The next morning, while Rick was refilling his bird feeder, he noticed an envelope wedged in his mailbox. Not the usual bill or coupon, but official white paper, HOA logo in the corner. He slid it open with a pocket knife, the way you do when you expect nonsense but hope for sense. Inside was a printed letter with courtesy notice at the top. Apparently, Rick had been reported for interfering with community hospitality. It warned that discourteous behavior toward guests could result in a fine if repeated. At the bottom, signed neatly, Karen L., Vice President, Cedar Pines HOA. He read it twice, then a third time, half expecting the punchline to appear. None came. The letter even had bullet points. He chuckled, the kind of laugh that starts small and turns into disbelief. "Interfering with community hospitality," he muttered. "Guess I'll need a permit for my own driveway next." The robins didn't answer. When his neighbor Mark dropped by later that day, Rick showed him the letter. Mark laughed so hard he spilled half his beer. "She wrote you up for telling people not to park on your property? Apparently that's hostile now." Mark shook his head. "Man, I told you, never make direct eye contact with an HOA officer. They sense weakness." Rick grinned. "I didn't think it'd escalate that quick. It's just parking." Mark leaned back on the porch rail. "It's never just parking. It's control. You'll see. For a week, Things were fine again. Peaceful, even. Rick mowed his lawn, waved at passing cars, fixed a neighbor's fence post. But he noticed small changes. Karen's guests started parking a few inches closer to his drive again, like testing boundaries. Her tone in the group emails grew sharper. Reminders about property maintenance, garbage bins, lawn length. Every message signed off with per HOA policy. As if that were scripture. Then came the follow-up letter, not as friendly as the first. Failure to comply with community standards may result in formal review. It cited continued interpersonal friction. No signature this time, just Cedar Pines HOA board. But the font looked suspiciously familiar. Rick set it down, rubbed his temples, and looked out the window at his quiet street. Somewhere across the way, Karen's laughter carried faintly through her open window. For the first time since moving here, the neighborhood didn't feel relaxing. It felt like a surveillance zone run by someone with too much time and too little perspective. Still, he tried to brush it off. Don't feed the nonsense, he told himself. He'd learned that in the service, never escalate a small problem into a big one if patience can outlast it. But that patience had limits. And as he folded the letter back into its envelope, something in his gut told him the line had been crossed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was principle. Or maybe it was just the fact that his driveway had become the community's overflow lot. That night, he sat on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the streetlights blink on. A pair of headlights slowed near his mailbox, Karen's SUV. She rolled down her window. "Evening, Rick," she called, cheerfully enough to raise suspicion. "I hope there's no hard feelings about the notice. It's just policy, you understand." Rick smiled thinly. "Sure, Karen. Just policy." She nodded like a queen forgiving a subject. "Good, because we're having another get-together this Friday, and I wanted to make sure we're all neighborly about parking arrangements this time." "Neighborly?" Rick repeated. "That's one word for it." She waved, perfume drifting across the street as she drove off. He sat there a long while after she'd gone, the quiet returning like a curtain falling. The sprinklers came on, hissing softly. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Rick took one last sip of coffee and said to no one in particular, "That woman's going to write herself a problem one day." He wasn't wrong. But when it came, it didn't arrive as shouting or confrontation. It came the same way the first letter had, quietly on paper, sealed and stamped. Only this time it wasn't his name on the complaint. Because by the end of the week, Karen's dinner guests were back. So was the silver sedan. And this time, when Rick walked out to ask them to move, there was no laughter, no polite excuse. Just an awkward silence. And the sound of Karen's voice from across the street, sharp and theatrical. "Officer, over here. That's the man I told you about." Rick turned, squinting. Red and blue lights flashed faintly at the corner. He sighed. A mix of disbelief and calm acceptance. The kind that comes from seeing a storm you already knew was brewing. "That letter," he said quietly, "really did change everything." The squad car idled at the curb, lights turning Karen's white siding into a patriotic disco. Rick leaned on his porch railing, coffee cup in hand, while the officer stepped out, clearly wondering why he'd been called to a cul-de-sac at 9 in the evening. Karen was already mid-performance, pointing and gesturing like she was delivering closing arguments. "That's him. He's been harassing my guests all week. They're afraid to park anywhere near his property." Rick stayed still, letting the absurdity breathe. The officer looked from her to him, then back again. "Ma'am," he said, polite but weary. "You called about a neighbor dispute?" Karen crossed her arms. "He keeps confronting people. This is a friendly neighborhood, officer, and he's creating hostility." Rick raised a hand. "Evening. Those people were blocking my driveway. Twice. I asked them politely to move." The officer nodded slowly, processing. "You own the property?" "Sure do. Deed and all." "Then they can't park there," the officer said simply. "Ma'am, unless he's threatening anyone, this isn't a police matter." Karen blinked. "But he's making it unpleasant for guests." The officer's tone flattened. So, he asked them to move their cars off his driveway? Yes. Then we're done here, the officer said, turning to Rick. Sorry to bother you, sir. Have a good night. Rick smiled faintly. You too, officer. Coffee before you go? Fresh pot. The man chuckled. Tempting, but I better get back to real calls. He tipped his hat and drove off. Across the street, Karen stood frozen in her porch light like a wax statue, clutching her HOA binder. Rick waved with mock cheer. Evening, Karen. She didn't wave back. The next morning, the entire street knew. News traveled fast in Cedar Pines, faster than Wi-Fi, slower than decency. By noon, 3 neighbors had just happened to stop by to check in. Each conversation ended with laughter and variations of, "You really got her good." Rick didn't think he had. He'd just told the truth. But truth had a way of sounding like rebellion when nonsense ran the show. Still, it was peaceful again for about 48 hours. Then came another letter. This one was thicker. More pages. Official header. Formal notice of community conduct violation. Apparently, Rick had been observed engaging in behavior that disrupts neighborhood harmony. It was a masterpiece of vagueness. No date, no details, just bureaucratic poetry written in passive voice. He read it twice, then laughed. If I keep this up, he told himself, I'll have a whole binder by Christmas. He called Mark over. Tell me if this sounds insane. He read the letter aloud. Mark grinned. Oh, she's spiraling. You embarrassed her in front of a cop. That's HOA blasphemy. Rick sighed. I didn't embarrass her. She did that herself. Doesn't matter. She's on a crusade now. Next thing you know, she'll fine you for improper cloud formation over your roof. Rick chuckled, but there was fatigue in it. He'd moved here for calm, not paperwork duels. Still, a certain stubborn streak kicked in, the kind forged by decades of maintenance checklists and commanding officers. He started keeping records. Photos of parked cars, timestamps, copies of every letter. Old habits die practical. A week later, he got another reminder email from the HOA list. This one warned about property presentation violations. Someone's porch light was the wrong hue. Karen had even attached a color temperature chart. Rick's light was 2700 K, soft white, apparently too warm for uniform standards. He stood outside that night, looking at his glow. Too cozy, he muttered. Across the street, Karen's LED floodlights blazed white-blue like a prison yard. He took a photo. Documentation just in case. Saturday brought the monthly HOA meeting. Rick didn't usually go. It was mostly complaints about dog poop and hedge height. But after 3 letters, he figured he should attend. The meeting was held in the community hall. Fluorescent lighting, a table of stale donuts, and that same burnt coffee smell that never quite left the air. Folding chairs lined up in rows. Karen sat at the front beside the HOA president, her binder stacked like ammunition. Rick found a seat in the back, quietly sipping the bad coffee. The meeting droned on until Karen cleared her throat. Before we close, she began, I'd like to address an ongoing issue of resident hostility. Heads turned. She looked directly at Rick. Some homeowners have been less than welcoming to visitors, creating a hostile environment that reflects poorly on Cedar Pines. Rick raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Let her dig. The HOA president, a soft-spoken accountant named Denise, looked uncomfortable. Are you referring to a specific incident? Karen smiled tightly. I think everyone knows who I mean. A murmur rippled through the room. Mark coughed, loudly. Someone whispered, Oh boy. Denise sighed. Let's keep it civil, please. Rick set down his coffee. Mind if I respond, since I'm the villain in this bedtime story? Karen's expression hardened. You admit it then? I admit asking people not to park on my property, yes. Didn't know that was a crime under section whatever. Chuckles spread around the room. Even Denise's mouth twitched. Karen huffed. This isn't a joke. We have standards. Rick nodded. Sure do. I just thought they applied to everyone. That did it. The room broke into whispers again. Someone near the back muttered, Finally, someone said it. Denise cleared her throat. All right, let's move on before this becomes unproductive. Karen snapped her binder shut like a gavel. Rick went home that night shaking his head, half amused, half exasperated. Petty wars, he told himself. That's what this is. A neighborhood running on caffeine and control. For a week, nothing happened. He thought maybe, just maybe, reason had prevailed. But that illusion died the next Saturday evening. He came home from the hardware store, arms full of supplies, to find 2 cars parked nose to tail across his driveway again. Same silver sedan. Same dinner crowd across the street, laughter spilling through open windows. He dropped the supplies inside, took a deep breath, and walked over. Evening, he said, calm as ever. Could I get you folks to move up a bit? You're blocking me in again. The man from before, golf shirt, smug grin, shrugged. Karen said it's fine. We're just here for an hour. Rick folded his arms. That's an hour longer than the property line allows. A pause. Then, from the porch, Karen's voice. Rick, maybe you should just let it go for tonight, No need to cause another scene. He looked at her. Scene? You mean asking people to respect my property? She smiled thinly. You're upsetting guests. It's unbecoming of a community member. He exhaled slowly. Karen, move the cars. Please. She disappeared inside without answering. 10 minutes later, sirens again. This time, 2 cruisers. When the officers arrived, Rick didn't even bother to explain. Let me guess, he said, holding up his hands. Disturbing the peace? One officer nodded, already recognizing him. Same address last week? Same cast, same plot, Rick said. The cops spoke to Karen for 5 minutes. Then one walked over. Sir, you're fine. They're moving the cars. Again. Rick nodded. Appreciate it. The officer sighed. Between you and me, she's known at dispatch. We get calls about non-compliant mailbox flags from this address every few months. Rick chuckled. Figures. As the police left, Karen stood by her mailbox, cheeks flushed. You think this is funny? She hissed. I think it's predictable, he replied. Her jaw tightened. You'll regret embarrassing me twice. He smiled, calm as ever. I doubt it. She stomped off, slamming her door so hard a porch light flickered. Back inside, Rick sat down at his kitchen table, surrounded by letters, printouts, and a steaming mug of coffee. He looked at the stack and exhaled through his nose. There was a point where irritation turns into purpose, and he'd just crossed it. He pulled out the HOA handbook from the drawer, the one Karen had proudly dropped off when he moved in. Per HOA policy, he murmured, flipping through the pages. Somewhere in here, he figured, was a rule she'd forgotten applied to her too. The porch light glowed warmly through the blinds. Outside, Karen's laughter started up again, brittle and forced. Rick smiled faintly to himself. I thought that was the end of it, he whispered. I was wrong. There's a certain kind of peace that comes after you stop trying to be reasonable with unreasonable people. It's not anger exactly, more like clarity. Rick sat at his kitchen table that night, the HOA handbook spread open like a battlefield map. He wasn't looking for revenge. Not yet. Anyway, he just wanted to understand the system that had somehow made him the villain for protecting his own driveway. But as he flipped through the fine print, the smell of cheap printer ink and bureaucracy rising from the pages, he started to see patterns. The same language Karen used in her emails. Per subsection 3A, in accordance with community conduct, was all right there, waiting to be turned against her. Halfway through section 4, he found it. Board members shall uphold impartial conduct and avoid the appearance of personal misuse of community authority or property. Rick read it again, slower. Misuse of property. He grinned. Well, look at that, he murmured. Poetic, really? The very woman who'd been using his driveway as her overflow parking was violating the code she weaponized. He took a sip of coffee, leaned back, and let the irony sink in. You know, Karen, he said to the empty room, you really shouldn't leave a mechanic alone with a rulebook. We find leaks. The next morning, he started quietly gathering proof. Not out of pettiness, though a little part of him enjoyed the symmetry, but because he knew she'd keep pushing. People like Karen didn't back off. They doubled down. So, every time her guests parked across his curb, he snapped a photo. Every group email she sent, he archived. Every neighbor who complained about her tone, he jotted down a date and quote. Just keeping records, he'd tell Mark, who now stopped by regularly just to hear the latest chapter. Mark loved it. You're building a case file, man. This is like Law and Order, HOA unit. Rick smirked. Let's just say if she's gonna live by the rulebook, she's about to trip over it. By the end of the week, he had enough documentation to rival a small law firm. But he wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. He wanted to make sure everything lined up perfectly. That's when he had an idea, one part irony, one part civics lesson. He started reading all the bylaws. Turns out, Karen had been bending quite a few. Unapproved exterior string lights? Check. Guest parking without permits? Double check. Using HOA communication channels for personal events? Triple check. She'd built her authority on selective enforcement, and Rick was holding the manual she'd ignored. The next Saturday, the neighborhood had its usual rhythm. Lawnmowers humming, kids on bikes, the faint smell of barbecue in the air. Karen was hosting another dinner, smaller this time, but still parked halfway on the curb. Rick watched from his porch, calm as a man fishing on a still lake. Every photo, every date, every file was now organized neatly in a folder marked Cedar Pines Documentation. He smiled at the title. It sounded almost official. Around dusk, his neighbor Denise walked over. Not the HOA president, but another Denise, 2 houses down. She whispered like she was sharing state secrets. I heard about the police thing. Is it true she called them again? Rick nodded. She did. Twice, actually. Denise shook her head. She's driving everyone crazy. Last week she told me my garden gnome wasn't in alignment with community aesthetic standards. It's a gnome, Rick. It doesn't have standards. He chuckled. You're not the only one. I've got 5 neighbors who've had run-ins with her. Denise crossed her arms. Someone should do something. Rick took a slow sip of coffee. Working on it. That night, he drafted a letter to the HOA board. Not angry, not emotional, just factual with bullet points and citations. He included photos of parking violations, excerpts from the bylaws, and a concise statement. I am submitting this complaint under Section 4C, Ethical Conduct of Board Members, regarding repeated personal misuse of private property and harassment of residents. He read it over 3 times, then printed it, slid it into an envelope, and set it on the counter. The sound of the paper against the countertop was strangely satisfying. The next morning, he dropped it into the HOA mailbox at the community park, the same one Karen had insisted everyone use for official correspondence. The irony made him grin all the way home. Now came the waiting game. He didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, the HOA treasurer, Paul, a quiet man who mostly spoke in spreadsheets, knocked on his door. Rick, you weren't kidding, he said, holding the envelope. This is thorough. You even cited subsection numbers. Rick shrugged modestly. I'm just following procedure. Paul smirked. You're the first person I've met who's actually read the whole handbook. Karen's gonna hate that. Rick leaned on the doorframe. Then maybe she'll read it next time. By the following week, whispers spread like pollen. Someone had filed an official complaint against a board member. No one said names, but everyone knew. Rick stayed quiet. He went about his chores, fixed a leaky faucet for the neighbor, trimmed his hedges. The peace was almost suspicious. Too quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then, on Wednesday evening, an email arrived. Subject line: Notice of Emergency HOA Meeting, Member Conduct Review. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night. Attendance mandatory for all board members. Rick sat back in his chair, smiling at the screen. They had no idea what was coming, he said softly. Friday arrived warm and tense. The community hall buzzed like a beehive when he walked in. Folding chairs lined the walls. The coffee was burnt as ever. Karen was already there, standing rigid beside the HOA president, her expression tight as fishing line. The whispers died down when Rick entered. He gave a polite nod to a few neighbors and took his seat in the back. The president cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming on short notice. We've received a formal complaint regarding potential misconduct by a board member. We'll be reviewing evidence tonight." Karen smiled, brittle and forced. "I'm sure this will be cleared up quickly." Rick didn't say a word. He just watched. The treasurer opened the file he'd submitted and began reading. Photos of cars parked illegally, copies of HOA emails, the printed bylaws with highlighted sections. Every word calm, professional, irrefutable. Karen's face shifted shades as he spoke. This is taken out of context," she protested. "Those were friendly gatherings. He's just vindictive." Paul glanced up. "Regardless, these are direct violations of Section 4C, which applies to board members specifically." Karen turned to the president. "You're not really entertaining this, are you?" The president sighed. "We're obligated to review any formal complaint. You know the rule, Karen." Rick couldn't help it, he smiled. A small one, just enough for himself. The kind that says, "I told you so," without words. As the discussion went on, neighbors began chiming in. Denise mentioned the gnome incident. Someone else complained about Karen's emails. By the end, it was clear the tide had turned. Karen slammed her binder shut. "This is ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." The president remained calm. "We'll reconvene after reviewing the full documentation. Until then, you're suspended from board activities." A stunned silence. Then whispers. Someone near the back muttered, "Finally." Karen's mouth fell open. "You can't." But the gavel came down. Meeting adjourned. Rick stood, nodded politely, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. The sound of sprinklers whispered again in the distance. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself. "Fair warning, Karen," he said quietly to the empty street. "I'm just getting started." Because somewhere deep down, under that calm exterior, Rick wasn't finished yet. He'd played by her rules, and now he planned to win by them too. The special session, as Karen called it, was scheduled for a Thursday evening. An odd choice for a neighborhood that usually avoided anything that might interrupt Jeopardy! Reruns. The email had gone out at 6 a.m., typed in her signature all caps subject line, "Urgent HOA meeting regarding false allegations." No one missed the irony that she had signed it, Vice President, Acting. The acting part had vanished from her title like she was trying to rewrite history through punctuation. Rick read it over breakfast and chuckled. "She's not even pretending to be subtle anymore," he said, stirring his coffee. Mark, who dropped by for his usual morning gossip, laughed so hard he nearly spit out his toast. "You've officially become her Vietnam," he said. "She's calling an emergency meeting to save face." Rick shrugged. "Let her. Meetings are where bad ideas go to die." By the time the sun dipped behind the cul-de-sacs, the air on Cedar Pines felt charged, like the whole neighborhood had RSVP'd to drama. Cars lined the street. Porch lights flickered on. People brought folding chairs even though the hall had plenty. The kind of turnout you only get for fireworks or scandal. Rick arrived 5 minutes early, calm and unhurried, wearing his usual jeans and flannel. The HOA hall smelled like burnt coffee, old carpet, and tension. Karen was already there, standing at the front like a general before battle, her binder open, pages marked with sticky notes. She'd even brought a laser pointer. "Evening, Rick," she said, with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Glad you could make it. I think it's important that everyone hear both sides of this misunderstanding." "Wouldn't miss it," Rick said, taking a seat near the middle. "Meetings are where democracy naps." Her jaw twitched. The room filled quickly. Familiar faces. Denise from 2 doors down, Paul the treasurer, the soft-spoken president, and a handful of neighbors who pretended they were just there to stay informed. The buzz of whispered alliances filled the air. You could practically feel the popcorn energy. The president opened with her usual soft diplomacy. All right, everyone. Thank you for attending on such short notice. This meeting was requested by Mrs. L. to address concerns regarding her temporary suspension. We'll give both parties a chance to speak. Karen straightened her blazer like she was about to argue a Supreme Court case. Thank you, Madam President. I want to begin by saying that this entire situation has been exaggerated beyond reason. I have served this community faithfully for 6 years. I've organized fundraisers, holiday light competitions, even that charity bake sale for the fire department. She gestured broadly, as if to remind everyone they'd benefited from her leadership. And yet, I'm being vilified over parking. A murmur ran through the room. Rick kept quiet, letting her dig the hole deeper. Karen clicked her laser pointer at a slide projected on the wall, an actual PowerPoint presentation titled Restoring Civility in Cedar Pines. The first bullet point read, Misunderstandings as Misconduct. Rick leaned over to Mark, whispering. She brought slides. This is going to be good. Karen talked for 10 solid minutes about community respect, collective harmony, and how certain individuals were weaponizing technicalities. Every sentence was dipped in self-righteous sugar. But when she pulled up a slide labeled Evidence of Harassment, the room collectively exhaled. It was a blurry photo of Rick, standing on his driveway, arms crossed. This, she declared, was taken during one of the confrontations. Rick raised a hand. Karen, that's me asking someone to move their car. You can even see your house in the background. Her voice sharpened. Exactly. The aggression is visible. Paul, the treasurer, rubbed his forehead. That's not aggression, Karen. That's gravity and posture. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen's neck flushed. This isn't a joke. The president sighed. All right, Rick, would you like to respond? Rick stood, not defensive, just steady. Sure. Folks, I like this neighborhood. I like peace. But I've been written up 3 times for protecting my own property. I've had the police called on me twice. All because someone decided the rules don't apply both ways. He held up a folder. Everything I submitted, every photo, every email, came from her own actions. All I did was read the rulebook she loves quoting. He set the folder down on the table with a soft thud that somehow sounded louder than Karen's laser pointer clicks. The silence afterward was delicious. Then Paul cleared his throat. We've reviewed the documentation and frankly, the evidence is clear. Repeated personal misuse of authority. Board bias. It's not a misunderstanding. It's misconduct. Karen went pale. You can't do this to me. I am the board. The president looked pained but resolute. No, Karen. You were the board. The board is made of volunteers, not monarchs. She gaped at her, then turned to the room. You're all just jealous because I care about standards. Rick couldn't resist. We care too, Karen. We just like them applied evenly. The crowd broke into chuckles. Even the president smiled before quickly composing herself. Karen slammed her binder shut. This is harassment. I'll have my lawyer involved. Paul leaned back. Good. Have them read Section 4C while they're at it. Karen stood, grabbed her things and stormed out, muttering something about ungrateful amateurs. The door slammed so hard the projector flickered. The room sat in stunned quiet for 3 beats. Then, almost in unison, people started laughing, the kind of cathartic, neighborly laughter that comes after months of silent suffering. Denise turned to Rick. You actually did it. You dethroned her. Rick raised his coffee cup like a toast. I just followed procedure. That's when someone suggested, half-jokingly, we should make him the new vice president. He laughed. Appreciate the vote of confidence. But I'm better with tools than titles. Paul grinned. Still, that was legendary. Rick shrugged modestly. Guess I'm more of a maintenance guy than a politician. The meeting adjourned in unusually high spirits. People lingered, talking freely without the usual undercurrent of fear. Someone even brought out cookies, actual edible ones, not Karen's fat-free oatmeal bricks of discipline. As the laughter died down and people packed up chairs, Rick took one last look around. He hadn't just won an argument. He'd changed the weather of the whole neighborhood. The air felt lighter. He stepped outside, the night cool against his skin. The streetlights glowed soft amber. Karen's house across the road was dark. No more dinner parties, no floodlights, no cars in his driveway. He leaned against his truck and smiled. "Poetic, really?" he murmured. A voice startled him. It was the same officer from before, walking up the sidewalk with a grin. "Evening, Mr. Lawson. Didn't expect to see you here again. Though I heard the fireworks from 3 blocks away." Rick chuckled. "No trouble this time, officer. Just democracy doing its job." The officer nodded. "Good to hear. Guess you two finally settled it?" Rick took a sip from his thermos. "She settled it herself with help from subsection 4C. The man laughed. "You're one of the calmest guys I've met who keeps ending up in police reports." Rick smiled. "I find if you keep your voice low enough, the truth does most of the yelling." The officer tipped his hat. "Well, carry on. You've earned a quiet street." As he drove away, Rick watched the taillights disappear around the bend. The sprinklers kicked on again, the soft hiss echoing across lawns. The sound felt like punctuation, the end of one long, ridiculous chapter. He looked back at the community hall where lights were flicking off one by one and exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. "At this point," he said softly, his voice almost amused, "I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality." Then, with a faint smirk, he added under his breath, "Because some stories just write themselves." The porch lights across the street flickered once more as if in reluctant farewell. Rick turned toward home, pocketed his keys, and stepped into the warm hum of his quiet house. Peace, real earned peace, finally smelled like fresh coffee again. But as he walked past his kitchen table, he noticed one thing waiting for him. A white envelope. Same HOA logo. Same corner stamp. He froze for half a second, then laughed out loud. "Oh, come on." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single line. "Notice of emergency meeting election of new vice president." He set it down and grinned. They had no idea what was coming again. By the time Friday rolled around, the whole neighborhood felt different. The constant hum of tension that used to hang over cedar pines had lifted, like fog burned off by sunlight. Kids were back to riding bikes. Neighbors waved again without scanning for violations. And for once, the HOA emails didn't sound like a subpoena written by a dictator with a wine glass. But peace in a suburb is always temporary, especially when Karen was still technically under review. Rick knew better than to celebrate early. Bureaucracy moves slower than gossip, and Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. Sure enough, 3 days after her meltdown, an email popped up in everyone's inbox titled, "Community Integrity, a call for transparency." It was 4 paragraphs of pure denial. She blamed targeted slander, abuse of process, and a misguided vendetta led by a faction of discontent homeowners. No names, of course, but everyone knew. It had the same perfume as every HOA email she'd ever sent. Rick just shook his head and muttered, "She really doesn't know when to stop." Mark, as always, had a front row seat to the chaos. "She's like a bad sequel," he said. "No one asked for it, and somehow it still got funded." Rick grinned. The good news is, sequels usually bomb faster than the original. Still, he wasn't naive. He expected one more stunt before this was truly over, and he didn't have to wait long. That weekend, while he was trimming his hedges, a black SUV rolled up to the curb. Out stepped 2 uniformed officers, same department as before. Rick groaned inwardly. "Let me guess," he said before they even spoke. "Karen again?" One of them smirked. "You're catching on." She filed a noise complaint. Said you were operating construction machinery outside quiet hours. Rick looked down at his hedge trimmer. "It's 3 in the afternoon." The officer shrugged. "We know. We had to come anyway." Rick turned off the trimmer, leaned on the handle, and smiled. "You guys want a soda? Might as well make the trip worth it." They both laughed. One accepted a can, and as they stood chatting by the mailbox, Karen's blinds twitched across the street. The officer waved cheerfully in her direction. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out. The blinds froze. Rick grinned. "I think she's rethinking her strategy." The officer nodded. "Well, if she keeps filing false reports, she'll be rethinking it from a courtroom." After they left, Rick sat on his porch with his laptop and typed up a final update for the HOA board, attaching every new report, including the police records from that day. His tone was polite but pointed. "Given the pattern of misuse of authority and harassment, I recommend we proceed with a final review as outlined in Section 4C. He hit send and leaned back, watching a butterfly drift past the porch light. He didn't feel angry anymore, just ready. When the HOA called the final meeting for the following week, attendance was mandatory again. Only this time, the agenda wasn't written by Karen. It was written by Paul, the treasurer, and it had just one line item: vote on removal of vice president, due to ethical violations. Word spread faster than fertilizer on a bad lawn. By Wednesday night, you couldn't walk your dog without hearing about it. Denise told Rick she'd baked cookies for moral support. Mark promised to bring popcorn. Even the usually silent mailman stopped by to say, "I'll be rooting for you." The meeting took place in the same hall as before, but the energy was completely different. People chatted easily, smiling, relaxed. The tension that used to hang over these gatherings, Karen's invisible aura of control, was gone. She was there, of course, sitting stiffly in the front row, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they might have been glued. Rick arrived with his usual calm demeanor, coffee thermos in hand. He didn't need to say much. The truth had already done the heavy lifting. The HOA president started the meeting briskly. "All right, folks. Tonight we'll be conducting a formal vote on the matter regarding Vice President L. The board has reviewed all evidence, including repeated instances of misconduct and harassment." Karen interrupted immediately. "Objection. These so-called instances are misinterpretations." The president gave her a look that could sand paint off a wall. "Karen, please. You'll have your chance to speak." Rick watched silently as Karen launched into another speech. This one lacked her usual composure. She talked too fast, waved her arms, accused everyone of turning against progress. She even claimed Rick had planted guests in her driveway as part of an orchestrated setup. By the time she finished, half the room looked somewhere between exhausted and entertained. The president cleared her throat. "Thank you, Karen. Now, before we proceed to the vote, I'd like to hear from the resident who filed the original complaint." Rick stood. "Appreciate it, Madam President. I don't have much to add. Everything's already documented. I didn't want a feud. I just wanted to enjoy my home without being policed for using it." He paused. "And honestly, I think most of us here feel the same way. We moved here for peace, not power struggles." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Even the quiet ones nodded. The president smiled slightly. "Well said. All right, let's vote." They used slips of paper, old-fashioned, anonymous. Rick didn't even look at his when he dropped it into the box. He already knew how this was going to go. Paul tallied the votes while Karen tapped her foot impatiently, muttering about conspiracies. When the counting finished, he looked up and said simply, 9-1. Motion passes. You could hear the air leave Karen's lungs. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You can't remove me. I built this community." Denise whispered loudly, more like micromanaged it. Laughter broke out. Light, genuine laughter that felt like exorcising a ghost. The president stood. Effective immediately, Karen L. is relieved of her duties as vice president. We thank her for her past service and wish her well. Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperate for support. But no one met her gaze. Not even her usual loyalists. She grabbed her binder and stormed out without another word, the echo of her heels marking the end of an era. As the door shut behind her, the president sighed with relief. "All right, now that we can breathe again. Next order of business. New nominations." Someone called out, "Rick!" Rick laughed. "No, thank you. I've had enough excitement for a decade." Paul grinned. "Then how about honorary consultant?" You seem to know the bylaws better than the rest of us combined. Rick raised his cup. Only if it comes with unlimited coffee privileges. The room erupted in laughter again, easy and genuine. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. No arguments, no bickering, no spreadsheets of doom. Just handshakes, small talk, and the smell of Denise's cookies filling the hall. Outside, the evening air was crisp, the stars sharp and bright. Rick lingered on the steps for a moment, listening to the soft chorus of sprinklers and the distant hum of crickets. It was the kind of quiet that had always been there but had gone unnoticed under Karen's reign of petty tyranny. The same officer from before strolled by on patrol, waving. "No calls tonight?" Rick chuckled. "Not unless she reports the moon for being too bright." The officer laughed. "Glad to hear it. Guess justice finally got served." "Huh." Rick nodded. Poetically, at that. When he got home, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat on the porch. Across the street, Karen's house was dark. The live, laugh, love sign still hung crooked by the front door, missing its last E. He smiled. Guess she finally ran out of letters. He leaned back in his chair, the cool air brushing his face, and let out a slow breath. The street was peaceful again, just the way it had been before all this nonsense started. He took another sip, feeling that quiet satisfaction only irony can bring. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler hissed on, and a porch light flickered. Rick smiled. "I finally mowed the lawn, smiling this time," he said softly, amused at himself. The neighborhood had changed, but in the best way. The rules hadn't gone anywhere. They'd just been reclaimed by reason. And as Rick sat there, bathed in the golden glow of his own porch light, the one that was apparently the wrong color temperature, he couldn't help but feel a little proud. Not of outsmarting someone, but of restoring balance to a place that had forgotten what fairness looked like. Justice, he thought, doesn't always need a gavel or a badge. Sometimes it just needs a man with a coffee mug, a camera, and a copy of the HOA bylaws. By midsummer, Cedar Pines finally sounded like a neighborhood again instead of a courtroom. The birds came back. Lawnmowers hummed at sensible hours. People waved without looking over their shoulders to see if someone was documenting it. The air, once heavy with Karen's presence, now smelled like charcoal grills and fresh paint. And for the first time since Rick had moved there, he could drink his coffee on the porch without bracing for a new letter or lecture. Peace, it turned out, wasn't silent. It just sounded like normal life returning. Rick had fallen back into his old rhythm, a rhythm that felt almost nostalgic now. Mornings started with the steady hiss of sprinklers and the faint jingle of a leash as the neighbor's golden retriever, Buddy, did his usual rounds. Mark dropped by most evenings, usually with some half-baked plan or gossip. Denise's garden bloomed wider than ever, and the HOA? It still existed technically, but now it acted more like a group chat than a governing body. The new emails were short, polite, and occasionally funny. The first one after Karen's removal had simply read, "New meeting minutes attached. Also, anyone know who keeps stealing the donuts?" Smiley face. That tiny smiley face might as well have been a revolution. Rick liked it that way, simple, human, neighborly. The way suburban life was supposed to be before people decided to weaponize lawn care. Still, every once in a while, a faint trace of Karen lingered, like the ghost of a perfume that refuses to wash out. She hadn't moved away. Her house across the street stood as prim and symmetrical as ever. But the curtain stayed drawn now. No more gatherings, no guest cars, no HOA meetings spilling onto her driveway. Occasionally, Rick would see her car backing out slowly, the tinted windows rolling up before she reached the corner. No words exchanged, just silence. The polite kind that says, "We're done here." He didn't mind. In fact, he found the quiet oddly respectful. Maybe that was the best peace they were ever going to have, mutual distance and unspoken truce. One afternoon, he was repainting his mailbox post when Denise wandered over with 2 iced teas and that knowing grin she always carried. "You know," she said, handing him a glass, "I think you might have saved this neighborhood." Rick laughed. Saved it? From what? Overzealous shrub management. She smiled. From itself. You reminded people that rules aren't supposed to be weapons. He took a sip. The tea was sweet, cold, and perfect. Well, he said, I didn't mean to start a revolution. I just wanted to park in my own driveway. Denise chuckled. Isn't that how all revolutions start? They stood there for a while, watching a kid ride by on a scooter with a superhero cape flapping behind him. For a moment, Rick thought about how far things had come. From police visits to iced tea on the curb, the absurdity of it all still made him grin. Later that evening, the HOA held its first post-Karen neighborhood potluck. Someone suggested the community hall, but everyone agreed it felt better to just set up folding tables right on the cul-de-sac. No speeches, no minutes, no printed agendas. Just food, laughter, and the smell of barbecue sauce. Rick brought his famous slow-cooked ribs, the same ones Karen once tried to fine him for making smoke visible beyond property limits. As he set them down, Paul the treasurer clapped him on the back. Man, you've turned into a local legend. I had 3 people ask me for your procedure template for dealing with difficult board members. Rick grinned. Tell them it's classified under section common sense, paragraph patience. Someone had brought a speaker and started playing old classic rock. Mark tried to dance. Kids chased bubbles in the street. A few neighbors even joked about putting Rick's face on the next HOA newsletter. Patron saint of reasonable homeowners, one of them said. He nearly spit out his soda laughing. But beneath all the humor, something deeper settled in. There was a shared understanding that small acts of sanity matter. That standing up quietly could ripple through an entire block. As the night wore on, Denise raised a plastic cup and said, Here's to peaceful neighborhoods, fewer meetings, and good fences that make great punchlines. Everyone cheered. Rick nodded, smiling. I'll drink to that. The evening wound down gently. Porch lights blinked on one by one, casting warm halos over freshly trimmed lawns. The laughter faded into murmurs and goodbyes. Rick stayed behind to help stack chairs, the kind of small act that keeps a community stitched together. When he finally wandered home, the street was nearly silent again. Crickets replaced the music. The air was cool and still. He paused halfway up his driveway and looked around. The same street that once felt like a battlefield of petty rules now looked like what it should have been all along. Home. He sat on his porch, the wood creaking familiarly under him, and poured one last cup of coffee. The porch light hummed softly, its improper color temperature, casting a golden glow over the yard. He thought about everything that had happened, the letters, the fines, the police, the meetings, the laughter that came after. It all seemed ridiculous in hindsight, but maybe that's what made it worth telling. Because in its own way, the story wasn't really about him and Karen. It was about everyone who's ever dealt with small people holding big clipboards, about the way power can turn silly when it's unchecked, and how quiet persistence can undo it. He chuckled to himself. You can't control the petty, he said under his breath, but you sure can outsmart it. Across the street, a light flicked on inside Karen's house. For a split second, he saw her silhouette move past the window. Maybe she'd heard the laughter from the potluck. Maybe she missed it. Or maybe she was just relieved to no longer be the center of it. Either way, she didn't look angry, just tired. Human. Rick raised his cup in a small, invisible toast. No hard feelings, he murmured. Just keep the driveway clear. He smiled, took a slow sip, and let the quiet wrap around him. Later that week, another HOA email went out, this one from the new president, Denise. It was short, sweet, and perfect. Community update. Lawns are green, neighbors are friendly, bylaws are balanced, and the donut thief has confessed. Mark. Life's good in Cedar Pines. Rick laughed out loud when he read it. Then he printed it out and pinned it on his fridge, the only HOA document he ever wanted to keep. As the days rolled into fall, the neighborhood kept its rhythm. Kids waited for the school bus at the corner. People decorated for Halloween without measuring each pumpkin for uniformity. And Rick found himself spending more time in his garage workshop again. The same people who once eyed each other suspiciously now traded tools and recipes. Every so often, a new family would move in and ask about the neighborhood. The story always came up eventually. Mark would embellish it, of course. "You should have seen it," he'd say. "Cops, petitions, bylaws." Rick here took down the HOA queen with nothing but a coffee mug and a calm voice. Rick would shake his head. It wasn't about taking anyone down. It was about standing up, just the right way. And that, somehow, became the motto of Cedar Pines. Months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Rick stood at the edge of his lawn, admiring how neatly the hedges framed the house. The mailbox gleamed with its new coat of paint. The flag on the porch fluttered in the breeze. He could almost pretend none of it had ever happened. But the peace in his chest reminded him otherwise. Karen's SUV drove by then, slow, deliberate. Their eyes met through the window. She hesitated, then lifted a single hand from the steering wheel. Not quite a full wave, not quite a peace treaty, but something in between. Rick nodded. "Progress," he said softly. The SUV turned the corner and disappeared. The sound of sprinklers came back, clicking rhythmically like punctuation marks on a long, ridiculous, perfectly ordinary sentence. Rick smiled, picked up his mug, and sat back down in his chair. "So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine," he said to the empty air, amused, "remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it." The coffee was warm. The morning was calm. And for the first time in a long time, the world outside his porch finally made sense.